Halpin from, from the Ontario Human Rights Commissions. And today's topic will be ageism and the rights of the older persons in Ontario. I would like to begin with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that we gather on a traditional territory of a number of First Nations and acknowledge their stewardship of this land throughout the ages. We seek a new relationship with the original peoples of this land, one that is based in honor and deep respect. Thank you. So a little bit about webinar housekeeping for today. As I had mentioned before, communication. So all our attendees are muted during the webinar. Our speaker will be visible while presenting, and of course for the Q&A session at the end of this webinar. We are very privileged as always to have our wonderful ASL interpreters with us, and they will be pinned and spotlighted throughout the entire webinar. For adjusting your speaker images, you can drag the line between the image of the frame of the slides to make to the left to make the speaker image larger. So this way you can set the viewing what is most convenient for you. Please feel free during the chat box to post any comments during the session, and please put all your questions in the Q&A box, and we will have time at the end of the webinar to get to those questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be available in the next 48 to 72 hours on the Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario website. We will have an evaluation at the end of the session. So we ask you, please just take a few moments to fill that survey out. Your feedback, suggestions for future webinars are extremely appreciated and valued. So if you could take a moment to do that, we do thank you in advance. Also, please, with respecting privacy and confidentiality, we do appreciate and understand that there are personal circumstances and issues which participants may wish to address. However, in keeping with our commitment to maintaining your privacy and confidentiality, we ask that you please keep the questions general that are posed through the Q&A box. If there is something specific you'd like to discuss with us about a specific circumstance, we invite you to please contact Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario after the webinar, and we can arrange for a confidential conversation so we can assist you further. Thank you for understanding. A little bit about Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, our mission is to envision an Ontario where all our seniors are free from abuse, have a strong voice, and feel respected. Achieving our mission requires raising awareness, delivering education and training, and of course, working with all the amazing collaboratively like-minded organizations in assisting with the service coordination and advocacy in our mission to combat elder abuse across our province. We work with public awareness and training, providing a multimedia public education program. And we encourage you to visit our website to look at our training form to book in some further sessions with us at any time, working with frontline training staff to help them enhance their knowledge and skills to not only recognize, but to be able to respond to elder abuse. And our community coordination with our 37 different elder abuse networks across the province, from north to south, east to west, working in community-focused information partnerships to help share information to combat elder abuse in their communities. And without further ado, I would like to now introduce our guest speaker for today, Bryony Halpin, PhD. She is a senior policy analyst with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Bryony brings a deep commitment to equity and human rights at the Ontario Human Rights Commission. She works on issues relating to COVID-19, education, poverty, and housing. Prior to joining the OHRC, she held roles at the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, as well as the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs. Before joining the Ontario Public Service, she taught at York University, the former Ryerson, ex-now University, and she holds a PhD in Environmental Studies from York University and a Master's in Public and Policy Administration from Ryerson University. We are honored and delighted to have her speak with us today. And without further ado, I will now hand over the webinar to Bryony. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Mary. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm very grateful for the invitation. So I'm going to touch on, Mary, you can move to the second slide there, and I'll just provide a little bit of an outline of the presentation today. So I'm going to speak broadly about the human rights system in Ontario and how human rights are defined and upheld in the province. I'm going to speak about particular dimensions of age and the rights of older people in that context. And I'm also going to talk a little bit more about what the organization I work for, the Ontario Human Rights Commission, the work that we have done in the area of the rights of older persons. And then, of course, I will open it up to some questions. Slide 3. So in 2008, there were major changes designed to renew Ontario's human rights system. They came into effect. And now the system consists of 3 separate and independent parts, which I will delve into in the next number of slides. So the pillars are the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. So that functions like a court, the Human Rights Legal Support Center, and the Ontario Human Rights Commission. So I'll detail what each of those mandates are in the next few slides. Slide 4. So the OHRC, or the Ontario Human Rights Commission, where I work, works to identify the root causes of discrimination and bring about broad systemic change to remove them. So we don't hear individual complaints of human rights abuses, but our focus is more on broad systemic issues and systemic change. So we address that in a number of different ways. The Commission develops policies, and I'll speak to those in greater detail later on in the presentation. We provide public education, like I'm doing today. We monitor human rights issues as they arise, as we've done for the last 2 years of COVID-19, for instance. We conduct public interest inquiries. Currently, the Commission has 2 inquiries on the go. We have an inquiry into the Toronto Police Services for racial profiling, and we also have an inquiry into reading disabilities and public education in Ontario. So those are broad public interest inquiries that all divisions in the Commission will work on. So we don't hear individual complaints. The OHRC may take its own case to the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, or it can intervene in human rights cases that it deems to be of broad public interest. So systemic, generally cases that reflect broader systemic issues. Our policies. So our policies that we draft at the Commission, and I'm going to speak to a particular one focused on the rights of older people later, but what our policies do is they set out our interpretation, the Commission's interpretation of human rights and obligations under the Human Rights Code. And what else, the policies also provide practical guidance to facilitate compliance with the code. So this could be guidance for government, could be guidance for service providers, could be guidance for employers. Our policies are not binding on courts or tribunals, but they're given great deference and they're often cited. So a number of OHRC policies have been cited by the Supreme Court of Canada, for instance, and a number of lower courts in Ontario. And they have different scopes. So our policies could be very broad and focus on a particular identity ground, such as creed, for instance, or they focus on a particular area, such as employment. Our policies are also different lengths. The creed policy, for instance, is a couple of 100 pages, where we have shorter policy statements that we've issued, for instance, during COVID-19, and those are just a number of pages. Next slide. So the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario basically decides if an individual's human rights have been violated. So if you think that your rights under the Human Rights Code have been violated, you can file a complaint. And a complaint is called an application. And you do that directly with the tribunal. So before 2008, you would have done that with the commission. But since the changes were made in 2008, now individual complaints go directly to the tribunal. And the tribunal decides the best way to deal with your situation. So sometimes that means it decides that your rights have not been violated under the code, or it decides that it does not have jurisdiction to deal with your case, so that your case is more criminal in nature, for instance. Next slide. So the third pillar of the human rights system in Ontario is the Human Rights Legal Support Center. So the Human Rights Legal Support Center helps people file applications with the tribunal, but it also provides other functions. It provides advice. If you are concerned that you or your loved one may have experienced a human rights violation, you can contact the tribunal, and the tribunal will let you know what next steps you can take. They also provide ongoing support through the filing of an application, all the way up to actual legal representation at the tribunal itself. So it's sort of like a legal aid clinic for specifically focused on human rights. Next slide. So human rights laws in Canada are both at the federal level and at the provincial level. There's many overlaps and alignment between those two jurisdictions, but I'll kind of parse them out for you. So we, of course, have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects human rights, protects against discrimination, but it's broader. It also protects civil and political rights, which the Ontario Human Rights Code does not. So civil and political rights would be like the right to assemble, for instance. The Canadian Human Rights Act is explicitly focused on anti-discrimination, very similar to the Ontario Human Rights Code. So those acts basically say that it is against the law to discriminate against somebody based on a personal attribute. And I'll get into that in a moment. At the provincial level, there is the Ontario Human Rights Code. And that, again, is also explicitly focused on discrimination. So you won't find things in the code like the right to assemble, for instance, or other political and civil rights. There's other pieces of legislation that protect people against discrimination and human rights in Ontario. These are things like the Anti-Racism Act or the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or the AODA. Next slide. So the foundation of human rights in Ontario is the Human Rights Code. The code was enacted in 1962. And the code is considered to be quasi-constitutional and is designed to protect against discrimination and harassment. So this means that because it's quasi-constitutional, this means that it has primacy over all other laws in Ontario, unless it's specifically mentioned in the code. The code was the first of its kind, a first of those of anti-discrimination, broad anti-discrimination laws in Canada. And before 1962, there were disparate laws that dealt with discrimination, but the code harmonized and brought them under one piece of legislation. The code prohibits discrimination and harassment in 5 social areas, and I'm going to speak to those in a moment, and based on 17 protected grounds. Now, not all of those protected grounds were in the original piece of legislation from 1962. We've amended the code a number of times in the last 60 years, and that includes adding different protected grounds as they've become more socially relevant. For instance, gender expression and gender identity. Next slide. So international roots. I think it's important to note that the code is rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Right in the front, in the preamble of the code, It reads, the recognition of the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family as the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. And this is in accord with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mention this because much of our work at the OHRC, when we're addressing broader systemic issues, often comes back to not only the code, but also international obligations that Canada has committed to. And we often look to the preamble of the code to guide our work. And I encourage you all to take a look at the code itself. You can see it online at ontario.ca, but specifically reading the preamble in greater detail. It's something that guides our work. Next slide. So in the preamble, the aims of the code are laid out, and the aims are to protect the dignity and worth of each person, to ensure equal rights and opportunities for all people in Ontario, to create a climate of respect and mutual understanding, and to ensure that everyone can take part fully in society. So while these feel like sort of higher level objectives, again, they guide a lot of OHRC's analysis in terms of how we deal with human rights issues as they arise, for instance, through COVID-19. We take the preamble of the code very seriously. And next slide. So I've mentioned this before, but it's worth saying again, the code has primacy over other laws. So unless there's a specific exemption within that law or within the code itself. So for instance, the Occupational Health and Safety Act or the Anti-Racism Act, if any part of those acts were found to violate human rights, the code would trump within the law. Next slide. So those 5 protected social areas of the code. So I'll start with goods and services, and this is really extensive. You'll get a sense of how far reaching the code really is. You have right in Ontario to be free from discrimination when you receive most goods or services or use most public and private facilities. So for example, this right applies to bars, restaurants, stores, hospitals, any healthcare services, schools, universities. It also applies to public places and amenities like recreation centers, public washrooms, malls, parks. Importantly, it applies to services and programs that are provided by both municipal and provincial governments. And the federal government, any services provided by the federal government would fall under the Canadian Human Rights Act, which really provides equal protection as the Human Rights Code of Ontario. But services and programs provided by the province, including things like social assistance, so Ontario Works and Ontario Disability Support Program, or other types of benefits, including OHIP, things like public transit, and things like policing. In housing, every person under the code has the right to be free from discrimination based on a code protected ground. So that means you have equal rights when you're buying a house, selling a house, renting, or being evicted from an apartment, a house, a commercial property, even a hotel. The code applies to the terms and conditions around housing. So this is things like leases, security deposits, etc. Relatedly, contracts, every person who has the legal capacity to enter into a contract can do so without discrimination. And that can be verbal or written, a verbal or written contract. And employment. So employment is huge at the tribunal. It accounts for about 3/4 of all human rights claims come from the workplace. And employment in the code is described in a very general way. So it captures independent contractors, volunteers, and all employees are covered. So one can file a human rights application against not only an employer, but against a contractor, against a union, against a board of directors. And I should note too that both in a union environment, both employers and unions have joint duties to make sure that the workplace is free from discrimination and harassment. Also in the code, the right to equal treatment means like applying for a job, being recruited, training, promotions, etc. Dismissal and layoffs, we see intersections here with ageism quite a bit. It also covers the rate of pay, so issues around pay equity have recently been at the tribunal, for instance. Shift work, benefits, holidays, etc. And lastly, relatedly, is unions and associations. So this social area deals with your right to be able to join a union or a professional association without experiencing discrimination. Next slide. So what are these code grounds? Basically, code grounds are personal attributes. So discrimination based on these 17 protected code grounds is against the law under the code. And you'll really find that most Ontarians will identify with one of these code grounds at one point in their lives. The grounds are citizenship, race, place of origin, ethnic origin, color, ancestry, disability, age, creed, sex or pregnancy, family status, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, receipt of public assistance. So this code ground only applies in the context of housing, and record of offenses. And that code ground only applies in the social area of employment. So your rights under the code, your human rights under the code, are not violated unless you have experienced discrimination in one of those social areas that I just spoke to, based on one or more of the protected grounds that I mentioned. So, for example, the code doesn't apply if you're walking down the street and a stranger insults you with a racist comment. Because it didn't happen in a social area, such as your job or in a restaurant. Of course, discrimination and or harassment on the street could fall under the criminal code, depending on how it's defined, but it does not fall under the human rights code. So there's a test kind of to establish a discrimination under the code, and a claimant, so an individual who says that their rights have been violated, must prove in the tribunal that they have one or more of a code protected ground. So ancestry and ethnic origin, or age and disability, that they have experienced not only adverse treatment, so you could call that direct discrimination, but also or at the same time adverse impact. And I'll speak a little bit about that in a moment. So adverse impact, or I could define it a little bit more now. Adverse impact means that if an action taken by an employer or an action taken by the government it leads to an adverse impact for an entire group of people protected by the code. So if there's a policy designed at the provincial level that means that people experiencing disabilities are not able to access their health card renewal, for instance, that's an adverse impact. And the protected characteristic, again, to establish discrimination, the protected characteristic or ground was a factor in the treatment or the impact. So the claimant has to be able to prove that it was because of my age, or it was because of my race that I was treated differently, or that the impact I incurred was because of those protected grounds. Next slide. So ageism. So age is a protected ground, as I mentioned, and people may experience age discrimination at any time in their lives. We know younger people experience it, we know older people experience it, and people in midlife might experience it at times as well. With that, the OHRC policy that I'm going to speak to about in a moment focuses on the forms of age discrimination that are experienced by people as they age. And this is in housing, goods and services, and employment. So certain groups of older persons may also experience unique discrimination or unique barriers because of an intersection with age. So this could be age and gender, or age and race, or age and culture and language, for instance. So we'll speak a little bit more about intersectionality as well. Next slide. So harassment and the connections to violence, discrimination and harassment and violence. So ageism and the general sort of negative attitude toward older persons is a key underlining contributor to elder abuse. And I know that this group knows that well, that broader cultural understandings of older people really function on a continuum towards violence or elder abuse. And we see that there's often ties between experiencing discrimination and harassment based on a code ground like age, and that can lead to violence. It doesn't always lead to violence, but it can lead to violence. So while the code itself does not explicitly protect people against violence, the code protects people against discrimination and harassment, but the commission and the human rights systems recognizes that continuum, that people can experience discrimination and harassment as usually a precursor to experiencing elder abuse or violence. Intersectionality is key here. We know that the potential for harassment and violence for a person increases the more code grounds that they're protected by. So if you have an older racialized woman who does not speak English or French, she may have increased vulnerabilities to elder abuse, for instance. So I'm just going to pause here for a moment, and before I give some context on our policy on discrimination against people, older people, I'm going to go to next slide and just pedal back to the OHRC and our strategic plan for this year. So, or for the last 5 years. So the strategic plan that we're currently working under for 2017 and 2022 lays out the areas of focus for the 5 years that we're in. So we're currently, we're about to embark on strategic planning for the next 5 years. But currently we're focused on reconciliation, on criminal justice system, including policing, poverty, including housing, and education more broadly. And I will say that there's a fifth area that has taken up a lot of OHRC resources in the last 2 years, and that is COVID-19. And all of these pillars are influenced by international treaties and conventions, but also influenced by what we have seen at the Human Rights Tribunal come forward as broad systemic cases as well. We also look, while strategic planning, we also look to global movements, for instance, around racism and policing, the urgent housing crisis and poverty, et cetera. So I just wanted to provide that context. And then next slide, I'll speak a little bit more about our policies. So the Human Rights Code authorizes, it's actually written into the code itself for the OHRC to develop policy. And those policies, as I mentioned before, provide guidance on how to interpret certain provisions of the code in a certain area. So they really drill down on the code and provide practical guidance to both rights holders and also duty holders. So duty holders would be governments or service providers, housing providers, employers, etc. Like I mentioned before, the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario can consider an OHRC policy, and they must consider a policy if an applicant requests it. If a decision is inconsistent with an OHRC policy, and the OHRC is a party or an intervener on that case, we can apply to have that case moved up to a divisional court. And most of our policies also have dedicated sections on international human rights obligations that Canada is party to. Next slide. So our policy on discrimination against older people because of age. So many of you may be familiar with this policy. We released it in 2006 and it was revised again in 2008. The policy was developed after extensive research and also extensive consultation to hear about issues of discrimination faced by older persons. The policy sets out the OHRC's position on discrimination against older people as it relates to certain provisions in the code. And it deals with part 1 and part 2 of the code. And that's really in the areas of the code where we discuss discrimination and harassment in the 5 social areas. Next slide. So the policy, like all of our policies, are designed to help the public understand how the code protects people, and in this case, how the code protects against discrimination against people as they age. It supports public education efforts. So older persons are aware of their rights to equal treatment. And again, it can be used in the courts and can be used, I know by, I'm sure, many organizations on this webinar today as an advocacy tool. And while the policy was developed and updated in 2006 and 2009, respectively, it still stands as the OHRC's interpretation of the code in these areas. Next slide. So the policy has a few more functions to it as well. It can also assist employers and service providers to understand their responsibilities under the code. It helps us. We often at the Commission, when we're writing other policies or when we're responding to a particular issue, we go back to those formal policies to help us understand age-related discrimination, for instance. It also provides a resource for educational initiatives and the development of internal policies and procedures. So we encourage employers, for instance, and government to look at our policies while they're developing their own human rights policies, for instance. Next slide. So I encourage you all to take a look at that policy. Our website, it's, I believe, in the materials or linked on the invitation for the webinar. Our website is very comprehensive. It has nearly every possible piece of work the Commission has done. We have a commitment to open communication with the public on our work. So you can read the policy there and related documents to that policy. And you can also read all of the links that I provided in this slide here are also on our website. So I'd like to sort of close with touching on some of the more recent issues that the Commission has addressed that relate to ageism or the rights of older people. And the first is long-term care. So as you're likely aware, in the summer of 2020, Ontario appointed Justice Morocco as chair of the Independent Long-Term Care COVID-19 Commission. And he and his committee was tasked with ensuring that Ontario's long-term care system is better able to meet the needs of residents and also better prepared for future pandemics. So when that appointment was made, our chief commissioner and wrote a public letter to stress the need for human rights principles to inform his work. Some of those principles were that, you know, all healthcare services related to COVID-19 and beyond need to be provided without stigma, discrimination, and harassment. Any restrictive measures, I know this has been in the news a lot, and it has the OHRC has been monitoring this as well, but restrictive measures about visitation to long-term care and to hospitals, et cetera, that deprive people of their liberty must be carried out in accordance with the law and respect for fundamental human rights. And our letter also stressed that in long-term care, it's the residents, but also the staff of long-term care facilities are vulnerable and code-protected populations at risk of discrimination based on on age, on disability, and on race and gender. The second piece of work or response that the Commission penned in March 2021, we received a request from Seniors for Social Action Ontario to undertake a public interest inquiry. I spoke to the two inquiries that are ongoing right now into the institutionalization of adults. We were not able to launch an inquiry at that time, but we agreed with the concerns and about the lack of effective community care for older adults, about the lack of effective and equitable oversight and enforcement by government and the police with respect to elder abuse, for instance. And we pointed to how our policy on discrimination against older people because of age speaks to many of those issues and made those recommendations to government as well. We highlighted also our work on COVID-19, which over the last number of years has focused on the unique rights of older persons. We were very involved in the issue of critical care triage and the development of the government's triage protocol, which would have, for those of you who that sounds foreign, it's triage is the decision-making tool when there's not enough ICU beds. So the province was drafting a decision-making tool should our ICUs go well beyond capacity, around 200% beyond capacity. The OHRC was significantly concerned with some of the provisions in that protocol, including for the rights, most specifically for the rights of people with disabilities and the rights of older persons. We worked for well over a year and a half directly with government on that protocol. We also articulated the need to make things like access to vaccines, access to testing, and access to healthcare more broadly for people with disabilities and older persons. Throughout the pandemic, we met with the minister a number of times and wrote publicly on those issues as well. The next piece is the AODA healthcare standards. So for those who may not know, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or the AODA, mandates that the province create standards for different areas with respect to accessibility. So Ontario is now doing their healthcare standards, and the commission shared a submission towards those recommendations. We supported human rights principles around accessibility in healthcare for system-wide requirements that ensure that accommodation needs are identified and acted on at each point of contact, that an overall organizational culture of accommodation needs to be fostered. So through education, anti-ableism, anti-ageism training. We supported recommendations around the respect for the capacity of persons with disabilities and the need to facilitate informed consent with accommodations in place in the healthcare system. And also related to healthcare, the health card renewal. So sorry, just 1 second, my computer is frozen here of my notes. In December 2022 or 2021, the OHRC wrote to the Minister of Health to share concerns that we had about the new health card renewal system. This was also in the news, and many of the webinar participants may be aware of it, but the province launched the healthcare renewal online renewal program, but you needed a driver's license to avail of it. So of course, many folks, older persons and many folks living with disabilities do not have a driver's license. So here's an example, a very clear example of disproportionate impact. So this is discrimination that through a policy, a systemic issue of discrimination, the policy clearly creates barriers for older persons and people with disabilities. we wrote directly to the minister on that, and changes were actually made to that program, which we were pleased about. And last, COVID-19 recovery. So this is another policy that we recently issued in November 2021. And that's our policy statement on human rights and COVID-19 recovery planning. So this is a broad policy, but it speaks to the needs and the rights of older adults, people living with disabilities, people living in congregate settings like long-term care, etc. And the objectives around that statement is to promote awareness of the negative impacts and the systemic issues that were exacerbated by COVID-19. Long-term care is a very, very clear example of one area where this was revealed. And to establish human rights principles, the policy establishes principles to guide governments as they plan for recovery. But perhaps most importantly, the policy lays out legal obligations that the government has, positive obligations that the government has to examine sources of discrimination and inequitable conditions, and to audit all policy and legal decision making for human rights issues as we recover from the pandemic. And last, the policy promotes compliance with the code to make sure that all vulnerable groups, including older persons, benefit equally from anything devised to promote pandemic recovery. So I encourage you to take a look at that policy, as well as it focuses on the rights of older persons and people with disabilities in a number of places. And that is it for my presentation. I wanted to provide a bit of time for questions. And I can see that there's a number. Maybe I'll rely on Mary or Brianne to.
Wonderful. Yes, definitely. Thank you so much. And just to let you know, the chat box has had so many great comments and feedback, and we do have quite a few questions that have come in, and I believe Rayanne, our director, is going to be helping to moderate now our portion of the Q&A with you.
Sounds great.
Thank you for that that great presentation. There's a couple of questions just related to discrimination. Should the code prohibit discrimination in all or any social areas?
Should or does?
Shouldn't it? Like, shouldn't it include?
So the code, it protects 5 social areas. They are fairly extensive. They protect where you work, they protect where you go to school, they protect any public service that you are in receipt of. They protect against discrimination in private areas such as gyms, restaurants, bars, associations, congregate care. So I haven't, I obviously did not draft the code in 1962 with respect to the rationale of the 5 social areas, but they are considered to be fairly comprehensive. There's really very few areas that the code doesn't protect under, that's not protected under either the Canadian Human Rights Act or under criminal law as well. So I think they're fairly extensive. Yeah, I hope that addresses the question.
The next question was, does the code cover private housing rentals? Because there seems to be a lot of discrimination, especially towards immigrants. And what would the code perfect them, or would the code protect them if they were to file a complaint?
Absolutely, yes. So the code, one of the social areas is housing. And rental housing absolutely is covered under the code. So if anyone experiences discrimination from a landlord, from another tenant, or from a housing corporation, a condominium, you name it, in housing, it's covered under the code. Also, being evicted yet from a hotel room, buying a house, commercial properties, it's fairly extensive. And I will echo that concern. Absolutely, there is much discrimination in housing against people coming here, new Canadians, against people who receive social assistance, against families, against single parents. Yes, we have been tracking for many years the discrimination in housing.
Okay. The other question relates to employment. So how is it possible for employers to refuse to employ seniors who might be over the age of 65? Because we do see that happening, and people report that and in the community. So, how does that happen, and then people get away with that?
Yeah, I mean, again, that's ageism. I'm not sure they get or like, how do they get away with it, in the sense that why isn't it a greater issue at the tribunal?
Yes, I guess. I guess it is
Yeah,
coming
I mean,
forward, I guess, in terms of complaints.
ageism and employment, whether experiencing ageism in the hiring process or experiencing ageism in dismissals, in promotions, and again, the code covers all aspects of employment. So that would be considered, that individual group of individuals would be considered experiencing a violation of their human rights. Absolutely.
Then there was just a question around the differences between the Ontario and federal human rights. Are they similar or different? And what are those differences?
Yeah, they're very similar. The Canadian Human Rights Act is also an act that is focused on discrimination and preventing discrimination based on protected grounds, so that they're almost identical. The Canadian Human Rights Act covers off those areas under federal jurisdiction. So again, this would be things like the military. The government is a federal employer, like the Canadian Human Rights Act covers the federal government as an employer, reserves, and other areas of federal jurisdiction, the RCMP, et cetera.
Okay. Just in terms of just keeping on with that conversation, the difference in terms of physical accessibility, and I'm thinking environment is maybe the question here, as well as language. Is that being addressed by the federal government and or Ontario government in terms of physical accessibility, as well as like French language services to access for language rights?
Physical accessibility in public places, or
Yes.
in housing, or
Public places.
Yeah, so actually just yesterday, the government finally, after a long period of time, appointed a disability commissioner, or accessibility commissioner rather. And so I know the Canadian Human Rights Commission, that's where that office will be housed. And they are, from my understanding, starting the process of developing accessibility standards, federal accessibility standards, that while they won't, again, they are not enforceable in the province, but they are used as sort of benchmarks for accessibility. It's similar for the National Construction Code. So Ontario has the Ontario Building Code, but the Ontario Building Code should be harmonized with the national construction codes. And we're seeing action now at the federal level and the provincial level to make sure those are in harmony with each other. I do know that there's work underway now that the Accessibility Commissioner has been appointed, and the Federal Housing Advocate has now been appointed as well. There's movement at the federal level to increase accessibility for the built environment. But of course, like a lot of these issues, there's jurisdictional issues there too. But we've been pretty pleased with how Ontario has responded, in the sense that they have showed an interest in harmonizing the national construction codes with the Ontario Building Code, but that's an issue that we follow very closely. I'm sure it's not lost on any of the members of this webinar that there is simply not enough accessible housing in Ontario, and that we have pushed publicly for universal design, so houses meet the needs of everybody through all their life stages, right? So whether or not you have accessibility needs now doesn't mean you're not going to have accessibility needs 10 years from now. So that's an issue that we follow closely.
Just in keeping to your comments around housing in that regard, there's just a comment that and a question that older people who live in congregate settings, such as retirement homes and long-term care, have had a lot of difficulty accessing complaint systems due to the power imbalances and many practical barriers. What types of supports or accommodations are in place to ensure that these people are able to meaningfully access the human rights system?
Sorry, are having trouble accessing the human rights system, or having trouble accessing like a complaint mechanism within their own congregate care setting? Just a little clarity on that.
Because it could be internal, but it could also be external as well, I would suspect. It could be just because they feel disempowered within the environment that they're living in, or don't have access to technology or phone to reach out to an external organization such as the Ontario Human Rights Commission.
Absolutely. And across human rights issues, we can see that this is a problem. Part of the reason in 2008, when they restructured the human rights system, it was in an attempt to make it more accessible, in the sense that an individual complaint wouldn't get triaged by the commission and then sent to the tribunal. An individual complaint could go directly to the tribunal, and hopefully have their case heard in a timely fashion. But we know that there's barriers. There's barriers for those who don't have access to the internet, for those who don't have otherwise have the capacity to bring complaints to the tribunal. To have a human rights system that's complaint based, does present those barriers. And that's why the commission's mandate is to address those more structural issues, the more systemic issues in the human rights system as well. In terms of an individual being able to access their own complaint mechanism within their congregate care setting, I'm not able to speak to that specifically, because I would have to have a little bit more information. But yeah, I mean, as an organization, we encourage all congregate care providers, employers, and governments to have human rights policies and accountable and transparent complaint mechanisms in place. And you can see that recommendation throughout our policies. And that's the advice that we would give at a systems level. But I'm unable to speak to the individual. Yeah.
So just talking building on that systemic response that you say is needs to be addressed, is there any mandates or any movement forward to address some of those systemic issues, such as people not having access to finances or having the literacy levels to access things online to access the process, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that access to justice piece is kind of is the backdrop to so much of what we do, right? So for instance, we launched a public inquiry into Toronto Police Services and racial profiling, because we heard from the Black community so much so that their communities were having trouble accessing justice, right? And we launched a public inquiry into reading disabilities, because we heard from families and communities that there was very little headway being made in the school system itself with access to justice for kids with reading disabilities. So that access to justice informs much of our work. And we give advice to government and advice to service providers all the time, in terms of it is their responsibility to break down those barriers. Because remember, they are the duty holders and not the commission. The commission provides advice to those duty holders to say, you have to eliminate those barriers to justice. You have to have transparent complaint mechanisms in place. You have to equip people with education on their rights. You have to have, in a hospital setting, say patient advocates. There's various ways that organizations can get to that removal of barriers. But really, that's kind of like one of the main issues that that focuses our work on, across social areas and across protected grounds, is that access to justice piece.
You just mentioned just briefly there about mental health, like hospitals and patient advocacy. So there was a question around mental health institutions, such as what you're speaking of. Is there any movement in terms of assisting individuals or patients to get legal help if they feel like their rights are being violated, or getting legal advice? I do know that, which I'll be posting on our website, that there is a legal support through the Ontario Human Rights Commission. So is that part of where someone would get assistance?
Yes. So the Human Rights Legal Support Center is a place where a person can pick up the phone and say, I live in X congregate care. I believe my rights have been violated based on a code ground because of my age, because of my race. And they can receive advice on what to do next. Okay. We can help you file an application. You need to get this information, those types of things, all the way up to providing you with actual legal representation at the tribunal itself. There's that. There's also more legal aid clinics. Legal aid clinics deal with issues around housing, around poverty, around social assistance benefits, all those types of things. So they are also a partner in terms of supporting people to get access to justice. But yeah, I mean, it's creating a system that is easy for people. This is something that the commission is constantly working towards, providing our best advice on how to achieve that.
Great. Okay, I have two last questions before we got to sort of wrap up.
Sure.
One's a quick one. Does the code protect in terms of housing, does the code protect condos, condo homeowners? Is that separate?
Absolutely, it does. Yep.
Okay. And then the second one is just based on the policy around discrimination against older persons, given everything that's happened with the pandemic and what we've seen with isolation, is there any movement from the commission to address systemic ageism as we move forward into that new strategic planning?
I can't speak to it now because we haven't done our strategic planning yet. We are embarking on it now. We're about to enter into an election period, which makes doing things like strategic planning kind of more challenging. But what I can do, I mean, if that's a recommendation from Elder Abuse Ontario, is I can take that back to our senior management as well to consider. And I will relay the questions that I've received here and some of the issues that have been identified for sure.
Right. And does it take a long time to get when the complaint is put forward to get that resolved or to get feedback from someone within the organization? Is that a long process, or depending on
for the
I suspect?
Tribunal or the Legal Support Center? Is like for individual complaint?
I believe that was the question in terms of how long it takes to get responded to. Like if you make a complaint, how long does it take someone to call you back or to follow up?
That I can't speak to particularly because it ebbs and flows, and we are independent from the Human Rights Legal Support Center in the sense that they have a very different mandate and function. But I know that they are dealing with many tribunals in Ontario. They're dealing with backlog and reduced capacity. So it can take some time, I think, to hear back about an individual complaint, but I can't speak to any specific time frame.
Okay.
I think there's a commit. If you go to their website, I believe they might provide a commitment on time on when you will hear back, at least with a certain amount of information. So I encourage folks to check out the website.
Okay, thank you. Mary, you can follow up.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Wonderful. That was great. And I know there was still a lot more questions coming through. So I will make sure we've got some of the information up to contact you through the Ontario Human Rights Commission. So
Sure.
just in closing, to let everybody know, we have our Ontario Senior Safety Line, which is available 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, 24/7, with over 200 counselors available in speaking 200 different languages available through calling them at 1-866-299-1011. And that is run by the Assaulted Women's Helpline, which offers support for seniors, information, and referrals. As well as feel free to connect with us at Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario through our social media, through our tools and resources. We do have customized training and education available. Visit us at our website and you will see all the wonderful programs that are available to continue education and training throughout the province. Some of our resources that are available for downloads are available through our site as well. So feel free to come and visit us at www.eapon.ca. And of course, our website launched at the end of last year. We are very proud of its look and feel and have received great feedback from all our stakeholders, and thanking them for letting us know that the website is such a resource tool for them to access any time of day or night. And of course, we can't end off without letting everybody know June 15th, it's World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. The theme this year, our rights don't get old. Some of the hashtags we'll be using, hashtag rights don't get old and hashtag WeAdd for 2022. Please join us on Wednesday, June the 15th for a very informative webinar from 1 to 2:30 p.m. being hosted by Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario, our partners at the Canadian National Prevention for Elder Abuse, the British Columbia Community Response Network, and CanAge. We've got our link there through the registration. Of course, it will be available on our website, and we will be sending that out through our newsletter as well on Wednesday, June the 15th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Take the pledge. We all have a role to play in protecting the rights of older people. No matter where you live in Canada, you can be part of this shared journey to create a safe and supportive society. So we welcome everyone to join us, that we pledge to work with our communities to make elder abuse a top priority. At the end, again, our evaluation will be sent out to everyone. So a quick moment to please fill that out. Feedback is always so greatly appreciated. And again, on behalf of the entire team at Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario, we want to thank you for your time today, Bryony. So much information, so much great conversation, and I know this will continue on. I'm sure we'll have you back for part 2 as we do continue on. So your information, of course, is available through the Ontario Human Rights Commission. The website, of course, is there, Bryony's email and phone number as well. And thank you to my co-host today as well, Rianne Rideout, my Director of Partnerships and Outreach with Elder Abuse Prevention Ontario. Again, I am Mary Shakuri, consultant with the APO. Feel free to stay connected with us through email, tweet us, Facebook, and as well through Instagram. We wish everybody a wonderful day, and thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you at our next webinar very shortly. Take care, everyone. All the best.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks all.
Thank you, everybody.